Good morning. Still is morning. Welcome. My name is Barbara Coyle. I am the Executive Director of the Virginia School Boards Association. The VSBA is a voluntary, nonpartisan organization of Virginia's school boards, and our goal is to promote excellence in education as an association through advocacy, training, and services. We're very fortunate in Virginia that we have 100% membership of our 134 school divisions across the Commonwealth of Virginia. The purpose of our conference today is to express the VSBA's thoughts on several pieces of legislation that will become law as a result of the actions of the just concluded Virginia General Assembly and the governor's amendments considered at yesterday's veto session. I would like to introduce our participants this morning for our press conference. First of all will be Juandiego Wade, who is chair of our internal Virginia School Boards Association Federal Relations Committee and a member of the Charlottesville City School Board. Next will be Roy Boyles, who is the president of the Virginia School Boards Association, and he is a board member from Warren County, Virginia. Following up from those two speakers will be our two lobbyists, Pat Lacy and Stacy Haney, who again represent VSBA and are also attorneys with the firm of Reed Smith in Richmond. We will begin with Juandiego Wade, who, as I said, a VSBA Board of Directors member here at the state level, and our Federal Relations Chair, and also a member of the Charlottesville City School Board. So, Juan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. It is my pleasure to share the impacts that the recently passed legislation will have on public education. First, House Bill 1999 and Senate Bill 1207, the A through F grading system. Currently, parents and stakeholders have access to detailed data about school performance and standardized tests, teacher experience and education levels, school enrollment and composition, and much, much more. An A through F system will convert a robust and detailed information into a simplistic grade that will not provide a full picture on the school's status and progress. A single grade doesn't provide parents and partners with adequate and transparent information that they need. Labeling a school with a single grade will mask the successes and challenges that stakeholders need to be aware to foster continual improvement. Second, the resource gap among localities. State funding is still below pre-recession levels, even though revenues have rebounded. Across the Commonwealth, localities are under pressure to keep up with rising healthcare costs, retirement, and energy costs. Third, the Virginia School Board Association is encouraged by the new bills that offer some flexibility to school boards to meet the operational and academic needs. These include the standard of quality staffing provision, that's House Bill 2066 and Senate Bill 1172. These bills give localities boards flexibility to assign librarians, guidance counselors, and school-based clerical personnel to schools in their division with the greatest need. This has been very well received. Additionally, the waiver for the third grade SOL assessment, that's House Bill 2144, which allows schools to focus on improving foundational reading skills rather than take standardized tests in science and history. On a more local note, the Charlottesville School Board recently adopted its budget. It was the 5th year in a row that we had to make some very difficult budget cut. In talking with other school board members from across the state, this is not uncommon. These cuts are not sustainable and cannot continue. It is not in the best interest of our children. Thank you, and I will now pass the podium over to Mr. Roy Boyles, President of the Virginia School Board Association.
Thank you, Juan. It's my pleasure to be here this morning with you. I am Roy Boyles, President of the VSBA. Very proud and honored to have that position, but I'm also just as proud and honored to be a member of the Warren County School Board. And as a local school board member since 2002, I've experienced many challenges struggling school divisions across the Commonwealth. With dwindling resources, rising expenses, and ever-changing requirements, school board members work diligently to ensure that they will make the best decisions for their local communities. Local school boards have guided their school divisions through budget reductions, new evaluation systems, and increased rigor for SOL standards and assessments. As we look to the future, several outcomes of the 2013 General Assembly session will have an impact on Virginia's educational system. There were some positive steps in the 2013 General Assembly. One was the 2% salary increase for teachers. While not all school divisions were able to come up with their share in order to get the state share, this was a positive impact on hardworking educators. We recognize our teachers as the single most best asset to increase student achievement, and those school divisions that were able to take advantage of that were able to thank those teachers accordingly. The other was the Teacher Fairness Act. This act will streamline the cumbersome grievance process for teachers who are not succeeding and provide local school divisions with flexibility to give provisional teachers more time to progress as they learn their profession. It also offers a model of collaborative effort between political leaders and educational stakeholders who are involved in shaping and improving the bill throughout its development. Opportunity Education Institution, House Bill 1324. Disregards and to a certain extent duplicates turnaround efforts underway in struggling schools already in partnership with government entities and external organizations. It creates another layer of bureaucracy with no requirement to useful or proven turnaround efforts that have already worked in schools to boost achievement in underperforming schools. Local citizens who have funded their community schools through their local property tax have no direct representation or role on the appointed takeover board, and there is no accountability to the local community for decisions made by the state. There are no support mechanisms for the involvement of parents or current public, private, nonprofit, or faith-based partners already working in those schools. State-level bureaucrats and private contractors will be in charge of the local schools. They will confiscate local school buildings and seize local funds. And there are certainly constitutional issues. Local school boards are assigned the responsibility of supervising schools under the state constitution. The statewide program envisioned for Virginia is modeled after a program in Louisiana that has fallen short of expectations. In that state, 3/4 of the schools are still failing 8 years after state control. I don't think Virginia's educational system should emulate Louisiana's system. Thank you, and I'll now turn the podium over to Pat, Lacy, and Stacy Haney, the VSBA lobbyists.
Thank you, Roy. And Stacy and I will be brief. We've talked about the legislation that has been passed that has been good and sometimes bad for the children and teachers and school boards in the Commonwealth. We would like to very briefly tell you about 2 initiatives that the School Boards Association will undertake in the next session of the General Assembly. The Virginia School Boards Association intends to ask the General Assembly to direct the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission to conduct a comprehensive review of the funding of the standards of quality. It has been over a decade since the funding of the SOQs has been studied. It is time to conduct such a study and to rectify the funding imbalance that currently exists in the funding of public education in Virginia. State funding of public education has consistently decreased over the last several years. The state per pupil funding of the standards of quality, adjusted for inflation, has gone from $5,274 in 2009 to $4,240 in 2014. And it's also important to note that the state share covers only the positions the state funds under the standards of quality, and there are many positions that are required to run a school system that receive no state funds whatsoever. While we are certainly appreciative, as was just mentioned, that the governor and the General Assembly funded the state share of a 2% salary increase, even factoring in the funds for the salary increase, the per pupil funding is still 7.5% less than it was in fiscal 2009. Also, because of the demands placed on public education and local government, a significant number of school systems will be unable to give a 2% pay raise in order to receive the state funding. Although the Virginia educational system ranks 4th in the United States, a statistic of which we all should be proud, it only ranks 37th in funding for public education. The federal government contributes approximately 6%, and the state contributes approximately 42%, while counties and cities contribute 51, almost 52% of the funding for public education. Every county and city appropriates more money for public education than the minimum required by state law. The Constitution of Virginia provides that the General Assembly should determine the standards of quality and prescribe them from time to time. The Attorney General has had the opportunity to interpret this provision shortly after it was adopted in 1971. I hate to say this, but I was actually in the Attorney General's office in 1971 when this opinion was issued. And the Attorney General had this to say, and this is very important, and this is the gist of why we're coming to the General Assembly. The standards of quality cannot be prescribed in a vacuum, but must be realistic in relation to the Commonwealth's current educational needs and practices. Similarly, in estimating the cost of implementing the standards, the General Assembly must take into account the actual cost of education rather than developing cost estimates based on arbitrary figures bearing no reasonable relationship to the actual expense of education prevailing in the Commonwealth. Unfortunately, and despite the Constitution as interpreted by the Attorney General, the past few years have seen a series of systematic changes to K-12 funding which have widened the gulf between the actual cost of education and state funding so severely as to strain the very meaning of reasonable. No one questions the severe fiscal stress faced by all levels of government. It is one thing to fairly and realistically address budget shortfalls. It is quite another to balance the state's budget by ignoring any realistic relationship between state funding and the actual local cost of providing an education. We must remain mindful that as the gap between actual costs of prevailing practices and the state funding grows, so does the potential for a constitutional challenge to the funding of K-12 education. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Stacy Haney, who will address another positive agenda item that we will have.
Thank you, Pat. In the next session of the General Assembly, the Virginia School Boards Association will seek a full repeal of the so-called King's Dominion law that since 1986 has mandated that each local school board must start school after Labor Day unless it has obtained a waiver from the Board of Education. The VSBA believes that each local school board should be allowed to set its own calendar and to determine the opening date for school each year for several reasons. First of all, and foremost, a local school board is in the best position to set its own calendar and to determine a start date that is best for the students and the community in that locality. It is a decision best made by local officials. Second, the current mandate that schools cannot start before Labor Day places the interests of the tourism and hospitality industries ahead of the interests of students and education. Third, mandating that schools start after Labor Day forces many schools that don't have waivers to miss valuable instructional time before the nationally normed tests such as advanced placement and international baccalaureate tests, which those tests begin in early May. It also forces schools to miss valuable instructional time before the SOL testing, which occurs in late May and early June. The SOL tests are driven by federal requirements and therefore cannot be moved to a later date in June. So in school divisions that don't have waivers and that must start after Labor Day, the students must take the SOL tests at least 2 weeks before the end of the school year. After completing these much emphasized high-stakes tests, many students understandably lose their focus and their interest in learning. Despite the best efforts of our teachers, the time after the SOL testing then simply can't be put to its highest and best use. It costs approximately $50 million per day to operate the Commonwealth's public schools. So the portion of that money, which is hundreds of millions of dollars, that is spent operating the schools that don't have waivers for those 2 weeks after Labor Day, could certainly be put to much better use if that money was used for instruction at the beginning of the school year, before Labor Day, and before SOL testing occurs. Michigan is the only other state in the country that has a law requiring schools to start after Labor Day. In addition, over half the schools in Virginia have waivers from this Labor Day start requirement. Therefore, the students from the school divisions without waivers are at a disadvantage because they're competing against the students in Virginia that go to schools that have waivers, and they're also competing against the students in the 48 other states that don't have this requirement that schools start after Labor Day. Now, this is a perennial issue that comes before the General Assembly, and the VSBA has always been in support of repealing this post-Labor Day start requirement. Opponents of the legislation seeking to repeal the King's Dominion law, which typically include the hospitality and tourism industries, claim that this legislation will have a negative impact on Virginia's economy. There is, however, simply no credible evidence that's been brought forward to support these claims. And when the potential impact on tourism is weighed against what is best for the students and the Commonwealth of Virginia, then the students must be put first. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Barbara Coyle.
I'd like to thank all of the speakers this morning for making some very valuable points on behalf of the Virginia School Boards Association. Again, we are an organization that is driven to promoting excellence in public education through, if you can see behind me, and all the speakers have been standing here, what we call our tagline of leadership, advocacy, and support. It's our role at the state, it's the role at the local school board level, and it's the role of each individual school board member as they serve on school boards. We're united in our passion for leadership, advocacy, and support. So I constantly want to reinforce that to anyone that I come across as the leader of the VSBA. I'd also like to say, as we move through the year, or the rest of this year, and into the next General Assembly, as Pat and Stacy both eloquently spoke to, that VSBA will continue to encourage Virginians, whether it's the politicians, local, state level, to keep education as a priority in this Commonwealth. Especially as we go through the next campaign period of time. We would like to focus and challenge our candidates to focus on public education, keep that as one of the driving forces as they campaign and move into the next General Assembly session in 2014.